The moral implications of starting a pop song with the command "go yourself" are, they're certainly something. So my friends, how are we? How are we doing? I have a very interesting video for you today. Look, I don't know who this girl is or what is going on in her head, but alas, I cannot help but feel like this song is like a little bit much. It's not this girl's fault, okay? Like, no hate to this artist. I can't tell if this song is like a profound, reference-heavy, mythological tale or like pretentious whining. You know what I mean? Like, I think that a lot of it doesn't make as much sense as she thinks it does. We're gonna figure it out. We're gonna figure it out today. That's what we're here to do. But please, as usual, do not go harass this person. They probably have the self-esteem of a broken teapot, I think. So this is all in good fun. That said, people were pretty mad about how I treated the All Souls trilogy. Believe it or not, I think that video is my most controversial to date. Who'd have thought? But people really felt like I tore that series to shreds unfairly just because I didn't like it. So in order to maintain my integrity and to put my money where my mouth is, I think it's only fair that I give every piece of art on this channel the same treatment. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, Biz, how are you going to compare a 3-minute mediocre pop song to a 2,000-page historical fantasy trilogy? Loudly. That's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it loudly, and you're going to sit and you're going to fucking enjoy it, okay? You're going to have a good time. Part 1. Oh wait, we're not. It says here to say don't say a title, just play it and put the word verse or another clever title on screen. So the first line of this song is "Go hang yourself." Go hang yourself inside the cave with the others. Inside the cave with the others, which is a wild sentence to start a pop song with. It's also a sentence that you must always finish. Because the moral implications of starting a pop song with the command "go hang yourself" are, they're certainly something to be studied, which admittedly is why we are here, correct? So like, my first thought is that it feels a little clickbaity, but you know, I'm a YouTuber, so like, who am I to judge? But giving the artist the benefit of the doubt and the presumption of innocence in thinking that she probably doesn't want anyone like dead yet. Let's look at the whole phrase, which is "go hang yourself in the cave with the others." Let's assume she means like a painting. Who are the others? What others? What are you talking about? Is this lost?
We have to go back, Kate. We have to go back!
God only knows. Also, what cave? Where are we? Where are we, ma'am? In what world are we being broken up with in proximity to a cave? How are we getting here? How are we getting to this cave? That's unfair. That's an unfair literal interpretation. Assuming we're not being literal, okay? Whenever people start mentioning caves, my brain goes to, well, honestly, my brain goes to the Thai cave rescue and that one time that soccer team was stuck in a cave, because I will never forget watching that documentary for the first time. If you don't know what happened, if you don't remember, if you like vaguely remember, oh yeah, there was like a soccer team that was like trapped in a cave in Thailand. If you don't remember how that story ended and you don't remember anything about it, stop everything, don't Google it, watch the documentary that's on Disney Plus. It's by the same people who did Free Solo, and I'll never forget watching that documentary. That story is wild. That is a wild thing. That was wild. But after that, I start thinking about Plato. Plato and I have a complicated relationship, as we know. But Plato pretty famously came up with this like allegory of the cave, right? Which is an allegory. And an allegory is, according to the Oxford dictionaries, a story or poem which can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. So it's like lies. The allegory of the cave appears in the Republic, which is this very long, like half political manifesto, half RPF, like half self-insert fanfiction, well, Socrates insert fanfiction about philosophy and education and how the world should be run. And the allegory of the cave comes up as this sort of metaphor, allegory, story thing about philosophical education. You've probably heard of Plato's cave at least once. There's prisoners, they're chained up. Doesn't matter how they got there. They were either born there or chained up since birth. That's not a very important part of the story. What is an important part of the story is that they have never seen the outside world. They have never seen beyond the cave. Now, if you're like me, when you think cave, you probably think of like an open-mouthed cave. That's what I think of. But no, that's not the cave. I'm pretty sure that what Plato was going for was like a mining, like in the ground cave. So it's like pitch black except this little fire, and the fire is behind the people, and all they can see are like shadow puppets of stuff in the fire, and that's their understanding of the world. Plato gets into it. I'm not going to. Point is, philosophers fucking love trees, so it's a bummer that these guys have never ever seen a tree. Well, it's a bummer until one of them gets freed. One of them one day gets freed. How exactly this happens, we don't know. Plato is very vague about it. We'll talk about it later. But one of them gets freed, sees the outside world, and is like, damn, this is sick, right? And so he tries to go back and tell his fellow cave dwellers that like there's a whole ass world that like they don't know about. And his fellow cave dwellers are like, that sounds like bullshit, and also you can't see as well now because he was up in the light and then he comes back down and you can't see as well in the dark anymore. And they're like, that is sounding a lot to me like you were blinded by this world, which is not something that we are interested in experiencing. So fuck off. They refuse to leave, and I'm pretty sure that they vow to like kill anybody who tries to free them in the future. Yeah, Socrates says, and if they had the opportunity, do you suppose that they might raise their hands against him and kill this person who is trying to liberate them to a higher plane? Glaucon, I'm afraid so. Anyway, big bummer. This sort of famous allegory is referenced all the time. It's referenced a lot because it speaks to human ignorance, right? It speaks to how if you've only ever seen one corner of the world, you might think that that is the whole world. Even if someone is telling you otherwise, if you don't have any evidence, any, first person experience, it's going to be really hard to convince you that there is another world. And it speaks to how difficult and sort of painful it is to have to change your understanding of your reality. And the fact that once you do, you can't really go back. You also can't make other people leave. We talk about this kind of stuff a lot when you're talking about people who are raised in these really tight-knit religious communities, especially like evangelical Christianity in the United States, where children are homeschooled, right? They're taught only ever creation. They're never even taught evolution or biology as an option. They don't watch secular media. They don't consume non-Christian music. They're so indoctrinated that by the time they are old enough to encounter the real world, by the time they are going to college or just branching out on their own, it's really, really difficult and really, really painful to work through the cognitive dissonance and to deconstruct that understanding of reality, which is why it's like called deconstruction, when you are questioning how true the Christianity that you have been taught is. Or it's too late, right? Sometimes it's too late and they just double down and they're like, sure, there are other ways of living, but they're wrong. Those ways are wrong. And then we start over. So even when it's not like explicitly being referenced in media, I feel like this allegory of the cave is kind of always ever present when we're talking about caves. Caves being this like dark, desolate place that is really difficult to get in and out of, very claustrophobic, right? Like it harkens back to this sort of fear of the unknown. I don't think that this singer is referencing Plato's cave. Sorry. If you think I wasted your time just now, you should have seen the entire tangent that I cut about what cave I think that Plato was referencing. Because he's clearly a metaphor. He's not talking about a literal cave, but like he must have encountered some cave in his life that it's coming to mind when he is doing this. Otherwise, his whole philosophy on art falls apart. And so I did spend a good like couple pages trying to figure out what cave he may have been talking about. That'll probably be up on my Patreon, maybe. Anyway, I don't think that Plato's cave is the reference, mostly because of the next lines. Go hang yourself inside the cave with the others. Welcome to my collection, Herodotus' eighth wonder. Herodotus is interesting because I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Herodotus. So there's that. I mean, in her defense, Herodotus's eighth wonder doesn't really flow as well. Like Herodotus's eighth wonder, Herodotus, yeah, it doesn't really work melodically. But like if you're gonna name drop the father of history, like you should probably get it right. I'm assuming that like she's only ever seen it written down, right? And she doesn't have, a YouTube channel where she regularly pronounces things incorrectly and tells herself live on camera, oh, I should really be looking this up, to the point where where it's actually kind of disrespectful and like a little bit of a problem that she really doesn't look any of these things up. And it's not because she doesn't care and doesn't have the respect for it. It's just because she forgets that they're in there because these scripts are so long. I'm assuming that she doesn't have that luxury. So she just like wrote Herodotus's Eighth Wonder and like went to the studio and rolled with it. Anyway, so Herodotus is a man. He is an ancient Greek philosopher, writer, traveler person. You know, sometimes we toss around the word philosopher a little too loosely with these ancient folks, right? Like anybody in the ancient world with a pen gets kind of deemed a philosopher. So I don't know if he's fully like a philosopher, but he did write a lot. He was the first guy to be like, hey, like maybe we should be writing shit down. Herodotus was like sitting around listening to his old ass grandmother lecture him on how he really should buy a house, right? Because renting is really a waste of money and you want to be able to increase the resale value of your home rather than spending all of this money on rent for something that you could lose at any moment. And if you can buy a home and increase the resale value of your home, you'll be able to supplement some of your retirement, right? Because when she was young, what she did was she was saved like a couple of gold coins every week just off to the side so that she and his grandfather could go and buy like a 5-bedroom villa, something small on the coast, and that had enough room for all of their slaves. And Herodotus is like, ma'am, are you sure that that's how it went down? He's like, that's not how the world works anymore. And he was like, I wonder how serious she is being. How honest is she about the way things were back in her day? And he realized that nobody wrote it down. So he was like, fuck, I guess I have to believe her. But my grandkids are not going to have to believe me on my bullshit. I'm going to write it down. And that is exactly word for word 1,000% how it happened. So he started writing shit down so that later when old people started to claim crazy shit, there was at least one person who could crack a book and be like, actually, grandma, the interest rates in 404 BCE were barely a fraction of the interest rates today, and the impact the Persian War has had on the economy is astronomical. And this is how he got dubbed the father of history. Put a pin in that little moniker, that little father of history moniker. But for now, all that you need to know is that one of the biggest projects of his was writing down the Greco-Persian Wars. And as part of sort of chronicling these events, he did a lot of traveling. And the rumor is that he wrote a list of 7 great sights to see, the most important things to see in the world. And we now know this list as the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The 7 wonders of the ancient world, because when people say 7 wonders of the world, they leave out the ancient. I don't know if there's a 7 wonders of the modern world, but the ancient is important. And let me tell you why, because this is the actual full list of the 7 wonders, right? Number 1, Colossus of Rhodes. In the harbor of the city of Rhodes on the Greek island of the same name, there are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, near present-day Hilla in Iraq, the Lighthouse of Alexandria in Alexandria, Egypt, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which would be in present-day Turkey, the statue of Zeus at Olympia in Greece, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, also in present-day Turkey, and last but not least, the Great Pyramid of Giza in Giza. Earliest of the wonders to be completed, and also the only one that still exists. The only one that you can still visit. Earthquakes really did a number on the ancient world. They really knocked through those 7 wonders of the ancient world. Although, to be fair, also, there is like a lot of debate about whether the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real. Some people are like, that is scientifically impossible to have upkept. I don't do science. That's the 7 wonders. 7, not 8. But what's really interesting is that even though Herodotus is credited in the encyclopedia and Wikipedia as having created this list of 7 wonders, even though his name pops up all the time when you start looking into this shit, my mans didn't actually write down a list of the 7 wonders of the world. Not that we have any evidence of, okay? That list of 7 things that I just gave you comes from ancient Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily. And there's another sort of similar list by Antipater of Sidon from around 100 BC and so forth. The only reason that we think Herodotus came up with an initial list is because there are references to a list of several world wonders, things to see in the world. So we're pretty sure that there was a list at some point. We just don't have that list. So he very well may have had 8, right? It could have included this mysterious cave with a bunch of hanging paintings of folks in it. It's an open-ended history, so to speak. So what we've got so far are is this invitation from our narrator to go and hang yourself up. We're going to be PG in a cave with the benefit of the doubt and join a collection that is so visually stunning. It has been deemed one of the 8 wonders of the world by Herodotus himself. Bit presumptuous, if you ask me. But I digress. All in the timing, you don't have to say it. Keep the tape on the bottle. You wish things were different. Keep the tape on the bottle. You wish things were different. This is probably a reference to a message in a bottle. Maybe perhaps telling you to keep it there, keep it in the bottle. You don't even have to open it because we already know what it's going to say. It's going to say something along the lines of, you wish that things were different in another life, yada yada. So just like save it, don't even bother, etc. The vibes that I'm getting from this first verse is that there has been a parting of the ways. A parting of the ways, if you will, and our narrator feels there have been others. She already knows what is in the bottle. This is old hat. It is not unique or interesting or special. And yet she has written a song, gone into a studio, recorded the song, paid for said song to be produced, mixed, and mastered by other people, completed an entire photo shoot for the song, and spent several weeks spamming her own social media pages with it. Part 2, a pre-chorus. I love a pre-chorus. I was born to understand, my blood turned soul into stained glass. I was born to understand. She gets it. She gets it. She's just like us. The stained glass thing is kind of interesting because that's like super not how glass works, right? Glass is actually kind of a crazy phenomenon, especially naturally formed glass like obsidian, which is naturally formed volcanic glass. I know that I just said I wasn't a science person. I don't know what to tell you. I lied. Volcanic, like magma. Volcanoes, lava, magma, right? Fucking crazy hot ass rock that cools really, really quick to make some sick ass looking glass. That's what glass is. That's what glass is. And manufactured glass, like man-made glass, comes from taking sand or silica or other rocks, heating them up like it's nobody's fucking business, and then cooling them down super, super fast, but like with intention. Also, fun fact, up until this point, I thought that sea glass was like a real, like a natural forming type of glass, because they mention it a lot in Revenge, which is a show that I love, and I just always thought that it was like a corally, like I thought it was like an ocean science thing. Like I didn't realize until I was like doing research for this video and I was like, oh, it's just litter. Like sea glass is just like glass. It's just regular glass that has been in the ocean so long that it's been like tumbled and is now shiny and pretty. Wild. But yeah, so like sea salt does not make glass. Regular salt does not make glass, and neither manufactured nor naturally occurring glass is ever aided by the addition of human blood. So she's a fucking liar. No, but this is not a crash course video, right? This is a pop song. So even though it's not natural, it is still an interesting image, I think, maybe. Because when we're thinking about blood and salt, right, there are only so many circumstances in which blood and salt come into contact. And like none of them are good. Right? We're either rubbing salt in the wound and a kiss on my cheek, or you're like trying to cover up a crime scene, right? Which, I mean, given the opening phrase of this song, not entirely off the table. But again, benefit of the doubt, salt in the wound. Willing to find my own shine. We're rubbing salt in a wound and it's turning into something new, right? It's generating something else out of this painful experience. And admittedly, it would be pretty painful to have the salt that is being rubbed into your wound suddenly turn into glass. I feel like that would not be helping the situation very much. But it's not just turning into glass, right? Like she says it's turning into stained glass. And also she doesn't necessarily specify that the salt is being rubbed into the wound. So if we're gonna like expand our thinking and, you know, throw her like a couple more inches of our suspension of disbelief, she just says that the blood turns salt into stained glass. So theoretically, whether you are physically rubbing the salt into the wound or like bleeding out over a pile of salt, it should produce the same effect by her logic. And now, before you call magic on this fictional metaphoric pop song by an artist that no one has ever heard of, let me tell you a bit about stained glass. Because stained glass has been around for fucking ever. It's colored glass. It's pretty. And the way that it gets its color is by the addition of metallic salts. So while you are heating the fuck out of those rocks and sand and shit, you throw in some powdered metallic salt and boom, sexy stained glass. Pretty fucking sick, not gonna lie. Metallic oxides is the sciencey term, and so like a copper oxide will make the glass green, a cobalt oxide will make the glass blue, gold makes red. Wait, is gold a salt? No. Oh, okay, no, gold is not a salt. My understanding of reality was about to be fundamentally changed. Gold is not a salt, but you can like make salt compounds with it. And that is the extent of my understanding from this Wikipedia page. Back to stained glass. Back to the problem at hand, which is this very less than ideal circumstance that we are in where blood is being combined with salt in some way. Very painful, but, you know, stained glass, very pretty. So like at least we're getting something out of this. Whatever this painful scenario is, she has yet to tell us. At least we're getting something out of it. Or we have in the past. Point is that in theory, there is a bit of a connection between salt and stained glass. And, you know, also we get given saline and stuff at the hospital. So I'm assuming there's like a level of salt in our blood, right? So maybe there's salt in the plasma, and maybe there is a world where you could use the salt from someone's blood to color the glass. Because iron's in blood, and iron's a metal. It doesn't matter. We are way off script. Don't take science advice from me. I digress. The actual physical makeup of stained glass isn't nearly as important as what the stained glass represents. Because like I said, stained glass is fucking old. Stained glass and the art of stained glass has been around for fucking ever. The first thing that comes to mind when we think about stained glass is church. Exactly. Yes. Thank you. If you didn't say church, I'm going to give you the opportunity now to go back and say it again so you can get it right. The first thing that comes to mind when we think about stained glass is church. Exactly. Yes. Don't worry. I forgive you. You're very special. Anyway, churches, cathedrals, Gothic castles. I made a whole video about the connection between art and religion and politics. And one of the major points that is explored in that video is the way that art during the medieval period was mostly, if not entirely and exclusively, funded and patronized by the church. And by the church, I mean whichever church was closest to the artist with the most money, the proverbial church of whoever was in charge at whatever given time. Because they had all the money, right? They had all the money. And since they refused to translate the Bible into native languages, and they also refused to learn to speak native languages or give sermons in anything other than Latin or Greek or the holy languages, they struggled to indoctrinate people, which is like a big problem when your whole thing is indoctrinating people. So what they did was they commissioned artists, right? They commissioned these massive stained glass window pieces that depicted various scenes of the Bible. It's visual learning, right? They built these big, beautiful churches as a way to honor God and also to like physically facilitate the spiritual experience. These massive stained glass windows with their sort of bending, curving, colored glass creates and helps facilitate this experience, which in turn of feeling closer to the divine, of closer to something phenomenal. That in turn makes bringing people into your religion much easier. If you feel good in the church, you're not going to be mad if somebody makes you go back. Even if you don't understand what they're saying, you know? If you have a good time is a good time. Just ask any American who's been clubbing in Berlin. So stained glass has this really interesting history in terms of storytelling and artificially manufacturing feelings and emotions, tricking yourself into feeling something, also creating something sort of aspirational, right? There's a ton of attention to detail. It's incredibly difficult to do, especially back then. And making the colored glass itself is like a painful and dangerous process if you're not careful. It is making something beautiful out of something very dull, but it's also at the same time making something that is rather fragile. There is a bit in my Flowers in the Attic video about Gothic architecture, specifically how it was kind of remarkable that architects were able to create these massive stone buildings with these huge high arched ceilings and buttresses and towers sitting on top of walls that were sometimes like 70% glass. glass. Like huge stained glass window murals. Like that was crazy. There's someone in the comments that like explained why it was crazy and impressive. I don't remember what they said, but they're there. So I think there are a lot of ways to interpret this line about blood turning salt into stained glass, all of which kind of lead back to this idea that the creation of something new and beautiful requires an act of suffering, right? Requires sacrifice in some way, which is sort of confirmed and confounded, I think, by the second half of the pre-chorus, which is, lay your secrets at my feet and God behold the mercy of me. This is actually one of my favorite lines in the song. Shout out to whoever wrote it. It calls to mind the image of someone who is like bleeding out, right? Who is in the midst of this practiced process of like making stained glass, you know, the specific skill set of generating stained glass with their blood. And at the same time, they're being asked to be the keeper of someone else's secrets, right? They are being interrupted by someone who clearly will not just go into the cave as previously instructed, and instead is on their knees asking for salvation, asking for confession, which is why I would like to tell you now about proto-martyr and equal of the apostles, Saint Thecla of Iconium. Saint Thecla was born, I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. Should I look it up? Thecla. Nailed it. Thecla. Saint Thecla was born in 30 AD in the city of Iconium, which is now in Konya, Turkey, and she is venerated in the Eastern Orthodox, Roman, Episcopal, and Oriental churches as a holy fucking badass. Holy fucking badass. Officially, that's her official title. Also, venerated just means that the church like gives you the stamp of approval for sainthood. It's like getting chosen to be in the like jumping chocolate frog things from Harry Potter. Like you get like a card. And so Saint Thecla is venerated as a holy fucking badass because she kind of was. Honestly, anytime a woman gets recognition in the church historically, it should be a big deal. So in all seriousness, for someone to be named equal of the apostles is a big deal, like is pretty cool. So her story is technically found in the Apocrypha, which is like a sequel to the New Testament. Because remember, what is the Bible? Just a book written by men. It's not magic. It's not the word of God. It is the word of people who really, really, really believed in God. All right. Even Jesus didn't contribute to it. It was compiled and distributed long after his reported death and, well, undeath. And if you know the Bible, then you know that like everybody had something to say when it came to the New Testament. Everybody had an opinion. Everybody had a couple chapters. Eventually somebody had to be like, all right, that's a wrap. Like we have to call it, right? Like we have to send it to the printers. I'm just kidding. They didn't have a printing press. That's a story for another day. But there was no like official council in the creation of the Bible necessarily. It wasn't like Jesus died and everyone sat in a circle and like came up with what is going to be the book that is read for the next 2,000 years. They were pretty busy, right? Their God had just died and then he came back and then he died again. There was a lot going on at the time. My point is, over the course of 7,055,628 schisms of Christianity, we have landed with somewhere around 8,532,675 different denominations of Christianity. And pretty much every denomination of Christianity kind of chooses when and where to end their Bible, right? Like they kind of choose what gets included and what doesn't, what translations they like to use, you know, whether or not they're going to use the word homosexual when that word wasn't introduced into any of the biblical texts until 1946. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of like biblical texts that some people recognize as canon and other people recognize as not canon. We all know what canon means, right? The best example, I think, is like Revelations, which was reportedly written by this guy, just some guy named John, who was in exile alone on an island going crazy. And he wrote this like insane premonition thing about, you know, the seas running red with blood and the earth opening up and all of that jazz. It's a riot. Everybody knows it, but not everybody considers it like actually part of the biblical canon. Most Western churches do, but a lot of Eastern churches do not recognize that. They are like, it's important, but like that's not canon. The same way that like I have decided that little scene in the 4th season finale of Doctor Who where he hands them like a bit of the TARDIS so that they can grow their own, that's canon for me, but it's not canon for everybody else. You know what I mean? Also, like in general, like it really is like fandom. You know what I mean? Like they finish spin-offs and episodes and things that don't necessarily jive with like the canon of the show, but some people are like that's canon and other people are like that's not. It's almost like religion's like made up. Anyway, the infamous sort of first wife of Adam, Lilith, is also not biblical canon. She appears in the 10th century work, which I'm not saying that because it was a long time ago. I'm saying that because it was a long time after, which is the Tales of Ben Sirah. And this is more Judaism, Hebrew understanding of it, right? Like it's based on a story that was developed in the Jewish practice of midrash, which is sort of engaging with not only like the words of the sacred texts themselves, but to kind of go beyond that, a little bit like fan fiction. I say that not in a joking way, but in an I made a 3-hour video on the Snape wives. I mean this extremely respectfully and can cite several academic sources on the comparisons between fan fiction and midrash as like academically and religiously dignified and fabulous kind of way. Like Lilith, that whole story of like Adam had this first wife and she like wouldn't listen to him, so he yeeted her, or God yeeted her, and then made Eve out of his ribs so that she would be like submissive and obey. That whole idea spiraled out of this need to kind of bridge the gap between two contradictory myths of creation that exist in Genesis. There are two. Anyway, in Christianity specifically, anything that is not canon is considered apocrypha. I don't know what other religions call stuff that's not canon. Within Christianity, things that are not considered canon to the Christian Bible are considered apocrypha or apocryphal as an adjective. And that doesn't mean that they're like not true or they're like bullshit, right? Like it's not like they're sort of shunned or like things you're not supposed to read. It just means that they're more meant to be read in private. They're not meant to be read during church. They usually are things that require a little bit more nuance. They're things that people think are worth discussing, but probably not worth having a whole sermon on. The book is long enough, we don't have the time. And Saint Thecla's story is apocryphal. It is from the Acts of Paul.
What do you want, Paul? Excuse me?
Paul, who, if you've seen my Midnight Mass video, has his own wild story of like crossing the deserts in Damascus to arrest Jesus, and then God comes down and is like, hey, maybe don't do that, please. And Paul was like, actually, yeah, fair. All right, you're right. Should I follow you? And God was like, yeah, obviously. And the rest is biblical history. Paul became a follower of Christ. This is also, if you are sort of familiar with the Bible, the very same Paul, I permit not women to teach, the apostle from Tim 2:12 or whatever. I have 2:12 written down here, but for some reason I feel like it's not that. Anyway, I say infamous because Timmy's little verse in the New Testament, Timmy's little remix, is responsible for a lot of the girl-defined nonsense that we have to deal with. Tim 2 whatever, Tim 2:1, Timmy Boy's little section is where we get that whole like women should adorn themselves modestly and sensibly in seemly apparel. It's that he's where we get that whole like wear not braids in your hair or gold jewelry thing, which admittedly does lead to that hilarious iconic moment of girl defined wearing braids in their hair and gold jewelry and talking about that verse, like just not getting it, just like just being like, you should really dress modestly, like don't look like a slut, don't dress like a whore, like oh my god, it's rough. I'm pretty sure Bethany's back on her bullshit. That's why I'm like being mean to them again. I was really nice to girl defined for a while, but where were we? Oh, anyway, so Tim didn't vibe with women, and according to Tim, neither did Paul. Benjamin Edsel describes Paul as the arch teacher and the pattern for others who teach the world. He was straight up like, I permit no women to teach, except for Thecla, apparently. Which is why this is such an interesting piece of sort of supplemental biblical canon, because like the way that Richard Purvo describes it in early Christian fiction is that Thecla, rather than the apostle, is their central character. Paul is a foil against which Thecla's radiance gleams. It's pretty sick. So the Veggie Tales, sort of my first apocrypha version of this tale, is that Thecla left her fiance to go and follow Christ and also Paul. Mostly Paul, but also Christ. That's like even kind of the first line of the Wikipedia page is like she left her fiance, which like the consequence for her leaving her fiance is that she's burnt at the stake, which calls into question, I think, how much of a choice she had in this marriage in the first place. Female sainthood, to be fair, is full of women, girls. I should say girls. They were often girls. Women and girls who did insane things to avoid being forcibly married off to terrible older men. Like many a lesbian in early Christianity became severely anorexic and married Ghost Jesus in order to avoid marrying marrying a real man. I'm just saying. Either way, even if the stories of Thecla leaving what would have been a very happy marriage in order to follow God are true, the phrase chose to leave, I think, is still putting it rather lightly. Also because our girl was down bad, okay? Like Bev Keane meets Tortured Poets Department levels of down bad, right? Like Taylor Swift standing on stage singing Fearless directly to Maddie Healy like 3 weeks after a breakup. Like she would visit him in prison. Oh, because Paul was in prison. And she would like kiss his wounds, okay? Like we're talking like daily letters to Ted Bundy levels of infatuation. Should I be comparing Paul the Apostle to Ted Bundy? Oh. She's like sentenced to burn at the stake, to which Paul responds with, oh, right, nothing. Paul's gone. Paul has since fucked off somewhere, but it's fine because thankfully God has her back, at least, since Paul did not. And she is like up in flames. And the Lord is like, not on my watch, babes. Not today. Saves her life and is like, go get your man. And she does. She goes to find her man. She finds him. She's like, hey, first off, alive, sick. Second off, I'm gonna cut off all my hair, dress like a man, and come with you because I believe in what you're saying. Do you know what this man has the audacity to say to her? This woman who just burnt at the stake in the name of his teachings. Do you know what this man says to her? He says, "The time is shameful, and you are beautiful. May another trial not overtake you worse than the first, and you not endure, but rather act cowardly." Translation: you're too hot to cut your hair off, especially if you're gonna crack the next time they try to burn you at the stake. Fucking rude, to be honest, but not nearly as rude as the fact that he still brings her with him. He brings her with him. They go, they travel, they wander a path together all the way to Antioch. He brings her with him on this road trip, and they run into a certain Alexander who is like, yo, is she with you? And Paul is like, nope. And fucking dips. He dips, leaves her with this monster who tries to her. Edsel writes, Paul denies his relationship with Thecla and promptly disappears from the scene, which is a great way to put it, because he really does. He dips. He's just gone. He's no longer there, and so Thecla defends herself, hits this guy upside the head, right? Sick. Would be amazing. You would think that's great, right? No, apparently not. She gets arrested. She gets arrested for this and sentenced to death, this time by wild beasts. But alas, she survives because of course she does, because God is on her side. And this keeps happening to her, by the way. This is like her whole thing. There's a whole thing about how like Paul wouldn't baptize her, right? Even though she was like, hey, could you maybe do that thing? You know, he's like, we'll get to it. But he doesn't baptize her. And eventually, since he's fucked off so many times, she's like, fine, I'm going to do it myself. She goes to like baptize herself in a lake that is full of like rabid seals, apparently. And instead of getting eaten by the rabid seals, God sends a lightning strike down and kills all of them to save her while she is baptizing herself. Sick. And then she decides that she is just going to cut all her hair off and dress up like a man and start, you know, teaching like Paul anyway. She's not like searching for Paul, but she's not like not searching for Paul. But she's just like, okay, I'm gonna cut my hair off, I'm gonna be a man, I'm gonna just do what Paul did, which is like, I'm gonna go around and teach. She like starts up her own little traveling ministry. In a 2014 piece called Saint Thecla, Remembering Paul and Being Remembered Through Paul, Peter Ben Smith writes that after the whole like Paul denying that she's his and leaving her to Alexandria and dipping out of the narrative thing, Paul is only allowed to make an appearance again towards the very end of the narrative. There, his role will be to acknowledge Thecla's new identity and ministry, given that she, remembering Paul, begins a search for him after her Anatokian trials and the beginning of her world as a teacher of faith. When encountering Paul again, Thecla does not behave vis-a-vis a disciple anymore, but as his equal, substantiating her behavior as follows, placing herself in a relationship to God that is analogous to Paul's relationship to God. She says, I took the bath, Paul, for the one who worked with you in the gospel, as even worked for me in the washing. And I love this story because despite this being like the Acts of Paul, right, which there are other sections, right, like this isn't the whole thing there, this is just like in the Acts of Paul, this is the Acts of Paul and Thecla, but within this section, right, like she is the central character and she is sort of putting his teachings to the test. But what's really interesting is that like she's never mad at him. Like I'm kind of giving Paul a lot of shit right now, but like Thecla does not. In fact, like Paul's acts are not ever really critiqued in this section. It's sort of all about Thecla. And even though we can sit here and be like, why didn't he just baptize her? And like, why did he let her come with him and then leave her? And why this and why that? Thecla like doesn't give a shit. Like, she's not concerned. Edsel writes, the first and most important is that at no point in the narrative does Thecla or any other allied character express any disappointment in Paul. He's never seen as like wrong for not baptizing her, even though like he was. We don't know exactly why it is this version of Paul refused to baptize her or was hesitant to baptize her, but like one major theory is basically that he was afraid that she would crack the next time she was sort of up against a wall, and he didn't want her to sin then, because sins post-baptism are like way harder to wash away than like sins pre-baptism. So I guess he was just being like frugal and like economic. But at the end of the day, like, he underestimated her strength. That was simply not true. She did not crack. She continued to be strong and maintain her faith, even though Paul didn't have faith in her. God himself literally did. Smith writes, Paul, his own behavior and views are corrected on the basis of someone else's embodiment and performance of the very gospel that Paul himself preaches, i.e., the word of God concerning self-control and resurrection, which is his teaching, and which is followed quite convincingly by Thecla, who indeed rises to the level of Paul in terms of leadership for that reason. Rather than villainizing Paul's actions, instead what is sort of happening is that we're propping up his teachings specifically and the act of following those teachings, right? Like, what's being propped up is the sort of exemplification of his teachings. It doesn't matter what Paul did or didn't do, what his reasoning behind not baptizing her was or was not. The emphasis is on the fact that regardless of how he behaved, she was able to use his teachings and take his lessons and save herself. Reading it from like a 2025 perspective, she saves herself through her own labor. And because he is never punished by the narrative, she sort of absolves him of any responsibility, right? Her labor and her efforts to follow his teachings and follow the Lord and do what she thinks is right allow him to maintain the status quo on his end. He doesn't have to change or work or do anything really, because he can just kind of leave her to the wolves, literally. He doesn't have to think about how his words and his teachings might be more difficult for someone who is, you know, a woman to follow. He doesn't have to think about how she is in a different position than maybe the men who follow him. He doesn't have to think about any of that. And because she doesn't harp on that and the narrative doesn't harp on that, like, he never has to face the fact that, like, yeah, he like kind of made some shitty choices. Because of his teachings, because of what he has said, he sort of gets off scot-free in favor of highlighting what we can learn and what we can do and what the strength of one woman's actual action can accomplish. Peter Ben Smith writes, thus, by viewing and remembering Paul through the story of Thecla, the memory of Paul is reconfigured. In this way, the acts of Thecla rewrite the memory of Paul by telling the story of Thecla and make the memory of Paul useful and relevant for those who were not endowed with the social roles and bodies that made them plausible candidates for ministries of leadership and teaching. But let's put a pin in that little rewriting of history and narrative bit while we talk briefly about one of Thecla's many almost deaths. Because basically every time Girly is about to eat it, she would just look up to the sky and be like, come on, really? And God would be like, my bad, sorry, and like send her a lifeline, right? Including this one time that she was backed into a corner in a cave by some assailants. And just before they killed her, she calls out to God, who opens a passageway in the stone for her to run through and then closes it behind her. Fucking sick. Cool as fuck. Can you imagine? It is 40 AD. You are chasing some woman for nefarious purposes. You backed her into a cave, which is like the ideal place to have backed a woman if you want to do nefarious things. And suddenly the wall opens up behind her. She runs through and it closes. Fucking nuts. Badass. So badass, in fact, that her martyrdom and willingness to die for Christ over and over and over again is so inspiring that another dude from her hometown named Chariton also decides that he's going to confess his love for Christ. Enter Chariton the Confessor. Chariton. I don't know. So Chariton the Confessor lived sometime in the like later 3rd century, and he was basically like constantly tortured all the time over his love of God, right? Like, this is like the people who made God's Not Dead's like wet dream, the amount of times that this man was supposedly like being waterboarded to say that he doesn't love God, right? Like, this is what the people who made the God's Not Dead movies think is happening all the time. And so during one of these events, he's like tied up in a cave, and he's waiting for his torturers to like get back from lunch, I guess. I don't know. They're God. And so he prays to God and he's like, look, do what you got to do, man. I get it. God, in true, God fashion, was like, not on my watch, bro. And so he sends a snake into the cave who spits poison into the evil dude's wine so that when they come back and start hydrating before their murder session, I guess, they all die. So Cheriton steals their shit, gives it to poor people, then starts several monasteries and moves to a cave at the edge of a cliff and dies peacefully. Cheriton was really into isolation. He was really, really anti-people. So part of me feels like his whole do with me what you will, Lord, was less Jesus take the wheel and more I am so over this. That said, caves, confessions, common themes here. Motifs we're seeing. Water, glass, blood, ancient wonders. So far, I am getting the vibes that the narrator clearly thinks that they are smarter than everyone else in the room, including, if not especially, whomever they are singing to. At least that's the vibe. Part 3, the chorus.
Did you get carried away by the way that I sang somebody else's name?
Did you get carried away? Hey, that's the title. Oh. Did you get carried away by the way that I sang somebody else's name? Were you caught in the current, crushed under the burden of your fingers crawling up my ribcage? Was it far too distracting? The sounds of me lapping up your leaking heartache. Did that December fog just make a losing dog look like a saving grace? I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot between the opening soundbite and this chorus. Somebody, and I'm just spitballing here. Somebody must have told this girl, something along the lines of, I got carried away, which admittedly is a confusing thing for them to say. I also don't really know what they could possibly mean by I got carried away. I don't know how you accidentally invite someone to take an Uber to South Philly for a date and then hook up with them. I have never tripped and fallen into somebody's tits. So I don't really know what he means, but also I'm not totally convinced that it is warranting this level of lyricism. This feels like a lot. This feels like it is coming from the type of person who would also rip themselves open for anyone who gives them the time of day, right? This sounds like somebody who might fashion their bones into something brand new. Someone who might raise an army of gods or follow you into war. Someone who might leave all the best pieces of them on the cutting room floor. But that's just speculation. Who am I to judge? We're not here to talk about whatever real life scenario may or may not have prompted this person to write this increasingly unsettling bop. We are, in fact, here to talk about the literary and historical references within said bop, which there are not many in the chorus. Chorus is not as clever. It's really not giving English major to me. We're sticking with the water, caves. Well, when I think of caves, I think of water, but it is also occurring to me that perhaps not everybody's instinct is to think of seaside caves, like the one in not a child called it, 5 Children and It, but it's too late. It's too late for that. She should have written a better song. Anyway, carried away, caught in a current. These are some dangerous territories that we are in, right? She also does mention lapping up someone's leaking heartache, which feels like water and also gross. Lapping is not a word that I love hearing. Also, you're not a dog. Oh, well, maybe you are. Who knows? I don't know. I don't know who this girl is. Maybe a dog did write this, but something is telling me that she is more of a cat person. Anyway, I mentioned the dog thing. I do have a reason for mentioning the dog thing. I mentioned a dog thing because we are, at the last line of this chorus, presented with what is either a clever reference or a complete ripoff of Mitski's absolutely seminal masterpiece, I Bet on Losing Dogs, from Puberty 2. That is a song where Mitski, an unreal goddess, an inhuman ethereal being who has written music that I think is 50 generations ahead of its time. Oh my god, I love Mitski so much I can't even make jokes about how emotional I get when I think about how much I love Mitski. Anyway, she has a song where she called I Bet on Losing Dogs that says, I bet on losing dogs. I know they're losing and I paid for my place by the ring. So I'll be looking in their eyes when they're down. And that seems like the kind of line that would really stick with a person forever. And maybe if that person that line stuck with went on to have their own music career, they might constantly be trying to achieve something similar. That seems like a line that might be so integral to a person's growth and their understanding of themselves that they might not even be able to help but reference it in their future work. And so that might be a reason why the final line of the chorus, did that December fog just make a losing dog look like a saving grace? I don't know, it also just could be a cheap knockoff. Like, come up with your own shit. To the verse. Has this gone too far? This is getting a little bit exhausting, to be honest. Have I taken the bit too far? They say I'm a prophet, but I'm the one they don't trust. I sleep in the barrels with the things they won't touch. They say I'm a prophet, but I'm the one they don't trust. I sleep in the barrels with the things they won't touch. This could be a Cassandra reference. Cassandra was a prophet who was cursed by Apollo so that she, would be able to see the future correctly, but no one would ever believe her. Just like a huge bummer. So this could be a Cassandra reference, but Cassandra is really out here like screaming to the world, and everyone knew she was there. They just didn't give a shit what she had to say. It's not like anybody didn't trust her. They were just like, she's crazy, right? She was also sort of cursed externally with this, right? Whereas like, I sleep in the barrels with the things they won't touch makes me think that this person is a prophet who scares people not because people think they're crazy, but because they might be right, which is a bit presumptuous of yourself, like, let me just say. But it does sort of line up with already knowing what is in the bottle and with there sort of being others in the cave, right? Like, this is clearly old hat, old ugly Herodotus hat apparently, but old hat nonetheless. And the cave reference is also what makes me think that this is probably a reference to Proteus, who is the old man of the sea in Greek mythology, because Proteus didn't just see the future. I mean, he did, but he didn't just see the future. He like saw all things. He knew all that is, all that was, all that ever could be. And he was not a fan of blabbing. He was like, this sucks. Like, no, I will not be giving you the lottery numbers, obviously. Proteus is this sort of like shape-shifting, crotchety old man who was like annoying and clearly vaguely miserable, bitching all the time and making everybody's life really difficult, which feels like way more in line with what this narrative is going for. And he lived in a cave, right? He lived in a cave and he would like shapeshift to hide from everybody all the time to avoid having to tell anybody their future. So if you wanted to get answers from him, you had to capture him, which Menelaus did in the Odyssey. And that is how he found out that Odysseus was stranded on Calypso's island. Which brings me to the next line. You're out in the water and I'm safe on the shore. So there's like a bit of a juxtaposition here, because often in like ancient and classic literature, even like later sort of Renaissance and Elizabethan stuff like Shakespeare and whatnot, when people are like exiled to islands, it's like not a good thing. People are like exiled there, right? Like they're kicked out, they're punished there. Like Revelations, right, was written by a guy who was like exiled to live out his days on an island or something like that. Shipwreck survivors are like fucked, right? Like The Tempest, whether it's punishment by law or punishment by God or just like shit luck, a person who is stuck on the shore is like usually fucked, right? Usually not winning whatever scenario they are partaking in. The only time it is probably better to be stuck marooned on a shore is if your other option is drowning. If your other option is being caught in a riptide on like a tiny little raft because you're trying to escape the wrath of some vengeful woman on an island with a cave full of bodies, then like, yeah, it's actually probably better to be safe on the shore. It just depends what shore. It just depends what shore, right? The shore that Proteus tells Menelaus that Odysseus, oh my God, these words, these names, is on, like, well, like he's, like, technically he's super safe. Proteus tells Menelaus, I saw him once on an island weeping live warm tears in the nymph Calypso's house. She holds him there by force. He has no way to voyage home to his native land, no trim ships in reach, no crew to ply the oars and send him scuttling over the sea's broad back. Odysseus is being held captive on this island, Ogygia? Being held captive on this island by Calypso. Calypso is a sea nymph that is in love with him, and her name literally means she who conceals. And more often than not, she is portrayed as overly emotional, crazy woman, right? Like she's a slave to her emotions, she's lustful and selfish, and the only thing that she cares about is keeping Odysseus and making him fall in love with her. That said, she does let him go. she does help him rebuild his boat so that he can leave, right? She offers him immortality to stay and he refuses. He wants to go back to his wife, so she lets him. So, like, is our narrator supposed to be Proteus or is our narrator supposed to be Calypso? Because if the narrator is supposed to be Calypso in this situation, right, like, is the object of her affections out in the water because she is Calypso and he is off returning to his wife or whatever? Or is he out in the water because she's Proteus and he's like drowning and she doesn't give a shit? Unclear. I'm unclear on who is what, why. Guess we know which one of us has been here before. So if we stick with this like Calypso thing, right? Calypso's whole backstory is that she is stuck on this island and she can't leave because she's like the daughter of a Titan and she sided with the Titans at like the War of Olympus. I think. My mythology's bad. But she sided with the Titans and so her punishment was to be cursed to live on this island that will give her everything she could ever possibly want except for company. All of her dreams fulfilled, anything she could possibly ask for except for someone to love her. Which is why she tries so hard to convince Odysseus that he is in love with her and that he should stay. And she can offer him immortality and riches, but at the end of the day, like, she can't compete with his love for his wife. So she helps him leave and she stays because she has to. There are versions of the myth where like this regularly happens, right? Like I think it's like she's cursed specifically every certain number of years to have a man wash up on her shores who will eventually leave her. And every time she tries to make him stay. She gets Odysseus to stay for 7 years. She keeps Odysseus for 7 years against his will, but also like he's fine. He's having a great time, I think. So that feels like it might be what we're going for, right? Because our narrator sort of knows the drill of this, so to speak, right? Go hang yourself inside the cave with the others. Clearly, this is not the first person to call takebacks on actively pursuing you for weeks. Seems like this is just the first person to not even bother coming up with a half-decent excuse, I think. Maybe this isn't necessarily a Cassandra cursed to tell the truth and no one will ever believe her situation. Maybe this isn't even like a Proteus is a little slick and difficult to catch situation. Maybe the real reason that no one trusts this prophet is because she's not actually a prophet at all. She's just a metaphor. And a pretentious one at that. She just thinks she's a prophet because of all, you know, the aforementioned cave of would-be almost lovers, or like this curse that has been bestowed upon her, right? Like maybe she just goes into situations expecting them to end a certain way, and by never taking the tape off of the bottle in the first place, it just becomes like Schrodinger's breakup. Or maybe he said he got carried away, and like, what the fuck does that even mean? Anyway, part 5, the bridge. The bridge will give us answers, surely. Guess you couldn't wait a few more days to turn me into your next big mistake. I mean, like, I hate to keep calling her presumptuous, but this is very much presuming that this man feels bad, which, like, is carried away a phrase that you would use to describe a big mistake? Or, like, is it the same phrase that I use when I spend too much money at Buffalo Exchange, or when I'm, like, just gonna put my dirty clothes in the laundry basket so I can get to my door, and then the next thing I know, it's 3 a.m. and my bed is on the other side of the room? We're definitely painting and projecting a certain understanding of the situation onto this retelling of it that we're doing, right? Like, do we really know if the perpetrator in this story actually sees what happened as a big mistake? No, we don't. Just like we don't know if Paul really saw his underestimation of Thecla as a mistake of any kind, or if it's just not that deep. And while we're on the topic of misremembering and factually questionable retellings, we might as well circle back to that father of history thing. Remember that guy from the beginning, Herodotus? She pronounces it Herodotus, but we're rolling with it because we can probably technically draw some lines between this like prophet who isn't trusted or listened to, or like not a prophet, thinks they're a prophet, whatever. Her metaphors are very mixed. Between that and this mention of Herodotus, father of history, because Herodotus, the father of history, was like kind of a fucking liar. Our man's history was actually extremely biased. Like, his heart was probably in the right place, if I remember correctly. I don't know. We were very drunk when we discussed his plans for creating history, but I think his heart was probably in the right place. But what often ended up happening was that he would just like write about events that like he did not witness and retell second and third hand stories with embellishments about places he'd never really seen or been, and like there were language barriers. And so it's like it's a bit more of like his story than history as we know it today. There's actually also like a lot of debate to be had about whether or not our understanding of that word is really what he was going for when he wrote it, but I can't speak to that. What we're getting in this narrative, in this bridge, is clearly a version of this story that takes him at his word, that he really did get carried away and that he regrets what happened between them. And unlike a retelling of Paul's teachings through Thecla, where Paul's actions don't necessarily explain or explore his motivations, this version of events is going to actively interrogate not only his actions in the actual night, but to interrogate his actions leading up to the events in question. Baby couldn't keep the wolves at bay. Which, again, ma'am, this feels a little presumptuous. Like, was it really this deep? Had to do it on my goddamn birthday. Okay, fair, lock him up. I don't even care about my birthday, but I recognize that it is pretty shitty to invite someone out, hook up with them, and then call take-backs like we're children. Assuming that's what happened, obviously. I wouldn't know. I mean, who wrote this? Is this something of an old habit? You build a city just to go and sink it. Do I have to explain the Atlantis metaphor?
It must have taken thousands of years to carve this thing.
Hey, look, I made a bridge. It only took me 10 seconds? 11 tops.
Side note, okay, I put that in as a joke, but if we really wanted to, we could look at that scene and how clearly, okay, so the plot of the movie is that this kid joins an expedition to find the lost city of Atlantis. He's got daddy issues or granddaddy issues or something like that. He is a big nerd about it, right? He's really stoked for this expedition. Everyone else is kind of just we are hoping to find riches and money. But sure, do your archaeological, historical research, whatever. And that scene specifically is we have Milo, who is our protagonist nerd boy, who is clearly under the impression that the simple fact of something being large and beautiful and impressive means not only that it must have taken a lot of work, but that people also value it in the same way that he does. This thing that he is seeing is this big, grand architectural masterpiece that took centuries or whatever, and the other guy is just oh, it's not that deep. Which in the context of our song, we have a narrator who clearly thinks that this must have been a big mistake for the person in question. They are assuming that the other end of this interaction and this equation not only valued the relationship in the same way, if you can call it that, but that this person also must feel a certain level of guilt. They know that they did something. But the very fact of someone using the phrase carried away makes me think that maybe this person doesn't think it's that deep, which calls into question the reliability of the narrator, because how serious could this have really been? Or rather, whose fault is it that one party brings in their daddy issues to the table, but on the other hand, on their birthday, really? How do you retroactively ruin someone's birthday? I feel you don't need to be a genius to know that that's not nice. And I wasn't gonna go into the Atlantis of it all, but I think I want to, because Atlantis, in the original myth, Atlantis was this super advanced city that 70% of the ancient wonders of the world was hit by an earthquake and sank. Only this wasn't a normal earthquake, right? One, because Atlantis isn't real, and two, because the earthquake was a punishment brought down by the gods, because the Atlanteans were cocky little assholes and they had advances in technology and they were flourishing, but they wanted to attempt to conquer Athens. You don't fuck with Athens, so down they go. So I think that there is something to be said here about maybe having a good friendship with someone and then actively sort of taking it across that line, asking for more, taking more, enjoying more, and then also wanting to sort of skirt the responsibility of that by pretending it was just some spilled milk. So in that sense, our narrator having this, what could be considered a bit of an overreaction, writing this song and releasing screenshots of the text message all over their social media, they could consider this to be sort of retribution for the hubris and the arrogance that the person on the other end of this sort of displayed in thinking that they could sort of blur the lines and then unblur them whenever they felt comfortable with it. Is this the earthquake that sinks the city? Maybe not. I don't think so. That doesn't super track because also our narrator is clearly very bummed about the sinking of the city. Also, nothing says hubris like comparing yourself to God. However, I implore you to hearken back to the pre-chorus, God behold the mercy of me, and look like a saving grace. And our girl, Saint Thecla, who is it that is always swooping in and saving her at the last minute? God, correct. Thank you. God, behold the mercy of me. We hearken back to the pre-chorus. Did that December fog just make a losing dog look like a saving grace? The gods will sink your fucking city on my behalf. Her behalf, whoever she is. Who wrote this? I don't know. It's still giving arrogant. Girl, not only are you mixing metaphors, but it was like very much not the Christian god who sank Atlantis. Like this is that's a big stretch. Also, can you confirm that the city sinking actually affected him at all? Because it kind of seems, again, like he didn't really give a shit about your fucking city. Anyway, he sank it on purpose. So actually, none of that matters. All of that made no sense, and all of this is getting a little bit out of hand, don't you think? This was funny for a minute, but now it's like, what are we even talking about? We are so many layers deep. There is no coherent narrative. I'm actually kind of ruining the song at this point. So yeah, the Atlantis metaphor is a bit much. It's a bit on the nose and also a bit confusing for the overall narrative. But at the same time, Milo thought that something that took years and time of effort and care turned out to actually have just been built in 10 seconds by someone who doesn't value it. Also, Atlantis is not real. Atlantis is not real. It was made up. It was made up by the same guy who invented that cave allegory, where the people are chained up in the cave and they only see the shadows of the real world and they assume that that's all there is. And then one of them is freed and he leaves the cave and sees the whole world. And when he returns to free the others, his eyes aren't used to the dark anymore and they can't see. And all the prisoners think that he's crazy and that the outside world is dangerous and therefore they are willing to kill anyone who tries to free them again. I said all of that earlier. Remember that story about the cave? Remember how I told you that Plato is not actually particularly clear about like how the first prisoner escaped the cave? Was he let out? Did he choose to leave? What went down there? That is something that is interpreted more or less by translators and by people who are retelling the allegory for various purposes. One thing that is clear and is consistent in Plato's allegory of the cave is that seeing beyond the shadows, even a little bit, is never without pain. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk toward the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceives someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. It's painful, physically painful, to see the light from the outside world, or even to turn your head. And it is also painful to then be told that what you have known your whole life is an illusion, and that what you are seeing now is the new reality. A.S. Ferguson writes in Plato's Simile of Light, "The cave, in fact, is arranged like the gallanty show of our grandfathers. It seems an entertainment, but is a prison, and whether the inmates will or not, their whole world is the shadow play." So yeah, maybe this is a little bit of a dramatic response to something that maybe wasn't that deep, but at the same time, we are all limited by our perceptions of reality, and the only reason that we know it wasn't that deep was because we were told that he just got carried away. But if we step outside of the cave for 5 fucking minutes, maybe we can see things differently. Maybe we all think that Calypso is this love-crazed temptress who kidnaps men that will inevitably leave her because she's crazy. Or maybe these men don't have the balls for Calypso in the first place. And it's actually really fucking nice of her to let them even spend 7 years on her island when she knows that eventually they're going to get bored and leave and want to go back to their exes that they probably didn't tell her about when they got there. It's actually maybe really fucking nice of her, knowing how this story goes every other time, to even give them the time of day to allow them to play out their little fantasy. Actually, it's really fucking nice.
Go hang yourself inside the cave with the others.
In conclusion, I have deemed this song mildly disturbing and worthy of at least one stream per person. I think it's reasonably poetic and thought out, and assuming that the artist doesn't do anything stupid, like go on a multi-hour long tangent about how metaphorical and referential her own song is, as long as she doesn't start explaining every single line in detail, forcing it down the throats of people who never really came here for the music anyway, then I think she'll be fine. Anyway, Carried Away comes out today. You can listen to the song now. It's wherever music is. And the comment shout out from last video goes to Silly Little Furcula. Sorry. I heard before we wrap it up and looked at the time, there was 1 hour and 50 minutes left. Never change. No plans to. Also, no, I've never seen Labyrinth. Sorry.
Welcome to my collection, Herodotus' 8th wonder. It's all in the timing, you don't have to say it. Keep the tape on the bottle, you wish things were different. I was born to understand, my blood turned soul into stained glass. So lay your secrets at my
Jesus.